The air over Davis-Monthan was hot and heavy, thick with the smell of jet fuel and desert dust. Captain Clara Jenkins knew the smell well. It was the smell of home, but lately, it also carried the sharp, acrid scent of disrespect. She stood a little taller than most, with strong hands and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of woman who was always ready for the next thing. She flew the A-10 Thunderbolt too, the Warthog, a beast of a plane, ugly and magnificent, built to take a punch and keep on fighting. Just like Clara, but her wing commander, Colonel Hayes, saw none of that. To him, Clara was a quota filled, a lightweight in a heavy iron world. Hayes was old school, all spit and Polish, convinced that close air support was a man's job. He'd nicknamed her, with a sneer he didn't bother to hide, the flight instructor, because she was good at teaching, but he believed she was soft when it counted. He liked to remind the flight room, in front of the all-male squadron, that the A-10's GAU-8 cannon was not a toy for fragile hands. Clara never argued. She just cleaned her cockpit canopy until it shone and waited for her chance. That chance came on a Tuesday. The mission was a search and rescue, SAR, deep into a new, volatile sector, a place command called the Kill Zone. An Army Special Forces team, codenamed Vanguard, was pinned down, low on ammo, and surrounded by a rapidly closing enemy force. The airspace was too hot for high-speed jets. Only the Warthog, slow and heavily armored, could get close enough to provide the needed cover. In the pre-mission briefing, Hayes's eyes settled on her, cold and certain. "Jenkins," he said, the disdain heavy in his voice, "this is a one-way trip for anyone who gets rattled. You stick to the coordinates, drop your ordnance, and pull out fast. Don't get emotional. We can't afford to lose a plane this far out for a pilot who hesitates." He made it sound less like an order and more like a prediction of her failure. Clara simply nodded, her jaw tight, and repeated the mission parameters in a clear, steady voice. She was not just flying for Vanguard. She was flying to prove Colonel Hayes wrong, even if it cost her everything. She walked out to her jet, the mighty Warthog, the Sentinel, and climbed the ladder. The plane was a shield, and her judge. Clara pushed the twin engines of the Sentinel hard. The Warthog didn't glide. It barreled through the air, a flying tank with wings. The flight felt heavy, not just because of the ordnance she carried, but because of the pressure. She was the last hope for the 7 young men on the ground. And she knew the commander was already riding her off back at the base as she crossed the border of the sector. The ground crackled with radio traffic, frantic and distorted. "Viper 1, this is Vanguard 6. We are taking heavy fire from the east. They are in the open. We need the gun now." The young voice was panicked, but the plea was clear. Clara banked hard, ignoring the distant, nervous voice of the Forward Air Controller, FAC, trying to warn her about newly detected anti-aircraft fire. She went lower, dropping below the effective range for most missiles, right into the enemy sights, but also into the perfect position to use her weapon. The moment she was steady, she lined up the target. Her hand was rock steady on the stick. The world outside the cockpit dissolved into noise. She squeezed the trigger. The plane shuddered violently as the massive 30mm GAU-8 cannon came to life, spewing out rounds the size of soda bottles at a deafening rate. The sound, a deep, tearing biati, was the sound of steel delivering justice. On the ground, the fire stopped instantly. Vanguard 6 was safe, for now, but the silence only lasted a second. As Clara pulled up, the ground defenses finally found their mark. It wasn't a missile. It was a heavy, coordinated barrage of AAA fire. The plane groaned. Suddenly, a deafening crash tore through the cockpit noise, followed by a violent yaw to the right. The fire alarm for the starboard engine screamed in her ears. She saw the visual. A massive chunk of the right wing, near the engine housing, was just gone. Smoke poured back, thick and black, obscuring her view. The engine was dead, maybe on fire. The controls were mushy, the trim system frozen. The Sentinel was staggering, badly wounded, like a great animal that had taken a mortal blow. She was over 150 miles from base, deep in enemy airspace, with half a plane, and a commander who already expected her to fail. She took a deep breath. She wasn't failing today. The roar in the cockpit was now a terrible, uneven shriek, one engine straining to do the work of two, mixing with a rush of wind tearing through damaged aluminum. Clara fought the stick, leaning her whole body into the effort to keep the Warthog straight. She checked the damage indicators. Starboard engine, gone. Right horizontal stabilizer, questionable. Hydraulic systems. 2 of 3 offline. She was flying with the bare minimum of control, a crippled brick hurtling over hostile terrain. She grabbed the radio MIC, her voice strained but level. Davis Munthan, Viper 1, declaring code red. Starboard engine failed, major airframe damage. Initiating emergency recovery sequence. Back in the command center, Colonel Hayes snatched the handset. His face, normally composed, was flushed with a terrifying mix of anger and fear. Anger that she'd taken so much damage, fear that he'd have to mount a humiliating, expensive, and dangerous recovery effort for a pilot he had always doubted. He listened to her coordinates. She was further out than he had planned. He looked at the map, then at the clock, and made a cold, calculated decision. Viper 1, Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, official register that carried a finality more chilling than an explosion. Mission success confirmed. You are too compromised for recovery. Current location is beyond safe extraction parameters. He paused, and then delivered the killing blow. Repeat, Viper 1, you are authorized to bail out immediately. A successful recovery is unlikely. Commander out. He did not wait for her reply, slamming the handset down. He turned to the senior officer present, his eyes hard. Draft the report. Presumed lost over enemy territory. Accidental overpenetration of the target zone. He wanted the paperwork done before she could even hit the ground. The news spread fast through the base. The young maintenance crew, who lovingly cared for the Sentinel and who respected Clara's calm precision, were devastated. Chief Master Sergeant Miller, the crew chief, looked at Hayes, his face white with rage. Sir, with all due respect, that jet can fly on a prayer and 2 coat hangers. If anyone can bring her back, it's Jenkins. Hayes dismissed him with a contemptuous wave. Nonsense. Miller. The commander said they'd never see her again. She flew too deep. Start processing her personal effects. She's not coming home. Clara heard the commander's sign-off. A successful recovery is unlikely. Commander out. The words echoed in her helmet, not as a resignation, but as a challenge. He hadn't just given up on her. He had authorized her failure. He wanted her to punch out, let the plane crash, and close the book on the flight instructor. He wanted to be right. A sudden, fierce resolve hardened her grip on the stick. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not now. Not after she'd saved Vanguard. The Warthog was a brute, designed with 2 redundant tails and armored to protect the pilot. It was nicknamed the Flying Survivability for a reason. Clara knew its soul, and she knew her own. She ignored the smoke alarm screaming in her face. She stopped trying to use the dead hydraulic systems, relying instead on the manual backup cables, the ancient, physical connections of wire and pulley that were the A-10's lifeline. Every movement of the stick was now a Herculean effort. She was flying by muscle and grit. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, but she kept the nose up. She flew low, using the desert canyons and scrubland as cover. Every mile was a victory, every breath a choice. She had to fight the constant tendency of the crippled plane to roll to the right, compensating with raw, grinding force. She thought about the young men of Vanguard, safe because she hadn't hesitated. She thought about Chief Miller and the ground crew who cared about the metal she was piloting. She thought about Hayes and his dismissive sneer. Unlikely, she muttered into her mask. I'll show you unlikely. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood, which only made the smoke pouring from the plane seem more sinister. She was past the enemy line, but the long, empty stretches of American desert were now her adversary. The fuel gauge was dipping rapidly. If she didn't get high enough, she'd hit the mountains before she could glide home. She pushed the remaining engine, pushing the sound barrier on a wing and a prayer. Every tremor, every rattle felt like the plane was begging her to let go. But Clara held on, her knuckles white, her focus absolute. She was bringing the Sentinel home, shredded, smoking, but whole. The atmosphere at Davis Munthan was grim. Colonel Hayes was in his office, polishing the language on the statement of loss report, trying to make the mission look less reckless and her performance less heroic. Chief Miller and the ground crew were gathered in the hangar, silent and numb, staring at the empty bay where the Sentinel should have been. The base was settling into the quiet, sorrowful routine that follows a presumed loss. Then, Sergeant Miller, walking out for a smoke, stopped dead. He stared at the far western horizon. Through the heat shimmer and the fading daylight, he saw something. It was too low to be a commercial jet, too slow to be a fighter. It was just a shape, a black smudge against the amber sky, moving with the sluggish, labored motion of something deeply hurt. He grabbed his binoculars. The smudge grew into a silhouette. He gasped, dropping the binoculars. He ran inside, bellowing, "Commander! Everyone! Get to the flight line! I see her! I see the Sentinel!" Hayes stormed out, furious at the interruption. "Miller, I told you, stand down. That's impossible. It's a civilian flight." He raised his own glass to his eyes, scanning the west. The silhouette grew closer, clearer, lower. It wasn't impossible. It was the A-10, unmistakable, a wreck of a machine but undeniably flying. The sight that approached was terrifying. The Sentinel was a horror show. The starboard wing was ragged. The engine nacelle looked like it had been chewed by a giant beast, and a steady stream of black exhaust and white vapor poured from a shattered tail section. It looked less like an aircraft and more like a ghost of war, scarred and smoking, dragging itself across the sky. The tower lit up, screaming instructions, but Clara's voice was calm. "Davis Munthan, Viper 1, I am on final approach. Manual controls only. Runway clear." She brought the plane in low and slow. The remaining engine whined under the impossible strain. The shredded airframe rattled like a skeleton coming apart. The moment the tires kissed the tarmac, the entire base held its breath. The landing was rough, but perfect. The Warthog rolled to a stop, smoking and triumphant, a shredded symbol of defiant engineering and pure pilot skill. Clara killed the engine. The resulting silence was deafening. The ground crew rushed forward. When they opened the canopy, Clara looked utterly spent, her face pale. Her flight suit soaked with sweat and hydraulic fluid. But her eyes held a spark of hard-won victory. Clara was taken straight to the medical center, exhausted but structurally sound. The A-10 was towed into the hangar under maximum security. Colonel Hayes, stunned into silence, looked on as technicians began documenting the damage. The report was catastrophic. Nearly 500 holes in the airframe. The manual flight controls were bent and frayed from the strain, and the damaged engine was riddled with shrapnel. The commander's dismissal had been wrong. Only the A-10's legendary design, combined with Clara's skill, had made that flight possible. 2 days later, the debriefing was held in the general's conference room. The general had flown in specifically to hear the account. Clara sat straight and calm, detailing the mission with technical precision. Hayes sat across the table, trying to look detached. Then, the general brought in the Army Special Forces team, Vanguard 6, flown in from their extraction point. The team leader, a tough-looking sergeant, spoke simply, "Captain Jenkins saved us. When everyone else pulled out, she came in low, took the hit for us, and never left until we were clear. She is the reason we are here." He looked directly at Hayes, who shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere changed when the general, reviewing the mission log, turned to Hayes. "Colonel, I see here that at 1635 Zulu, you issued a formal presumed lost declaration and authorized Captain Jenkins to bail out, without attempting a recovery coordination. Is that correct?" Hayes began to stammer. "Sir, the risk was extreme. The distance, the damage. I had to prioritize the safety of the recovery assets and minimize the official loss." Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet, but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Sir," she addressed the general, "I was never lost. I was damaged. And when I needed a commander to believe in the mission, or at least in the machine he commands, I was told I was unlikely to succeed. I flew home anyway because Vanguard needed to know their sacrifice was worth it, and because I needed to prove the commander's prediction of my failure was, in fact, his own lack of faith." The general didn't need to hear anything else. Hayes's betrayal, his quick, cold abandonment of a soldier to save face and paper, was exposed. He was removed from command quietly before the week was out. A month later, under a clear desert sky, Captain Clara Jenkins stood on the parade ground. The ceremony was simple, but the message was immense. The general pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross onto her uniform. As the crowd applauded, Chief Miller stood nearest to her. He didn't use her old, derisive nickname. He just gave a sharp, crisp salute, his eyes full of respect, and said, "Welcome home, Captain. You and your bird are something else." The Warthog, the Sentinel, was already being repaired. It would fly again, and everyone who saw it knew that the scars it carried were the price of true strength. The ceremony was over, but the fight was not. The Distinguished Flying Cross felt heavy, a strange mix of pride and pain. Clara was physically recovered, but the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of that flight lingered. She felt disconnected from the cheers and the handshakes. The plane, the Sentinel, was in pieces in the giant hangar, a constant, silent reminder of what she had faced. To Clara, the medal wasn't for being brave. It was for being too stubborn to quit. Colonel Hayes was gone, transferred to a desk job far away, but his friends and his old way of thinking still had power. Within 2 weeks, the base command announced a formal accident review board. They claimed it was routine, but the goal was clear: to officially determine if pilot error contributed to the loss of airframe integrity. It was a cold, bureaucratic attempt to tarnish her heroism and protect the reputation of the officers who had endorsed Hayes' command. They couldn't say she was lost, so they aimed to call her reckless. Clara sat in her small, quiet apartment, reviewing her flight recorder data. She knew every choice she made was the right one. She felt the injustice deeply. It wasn't about the plane. It was about the easy path they always took, blaming the one who pushed hardest. One evening, Chief Miller showed up, not in uniform, but in a simple t-shirt. He didn't talk about the board. Instead, he brought photos of the Sentinel's repair work. "Look here, Captain," he said, pointing to a patch of new aluminum. "We're using a stronger alloy on this section. She'll be better than she was." He paused, setting the photos down. "Don't let those paper pushers worry you. We know what you did. The guys in the hangar, we are keeping our eyes open. We are your backup now." His simple loyalty was the only thing that felt real. Clara knew she still had one final battle to win, and this time, the weapon wouldn't be the GAU-8 cannon, but the truth. The accident review board convened in a small, windowless room. 3 stiff-backed colonels sat behind a mahogany table, their faces set in expressions of clinical disinterest. They went through the data, questioning Clara's low altitude, her choice to fly a damaged aircraft, and her decision to ignore the commander's authorized bailout order. "Captain Jenkins," asked the senior colonel, his voice dry and procedural, "your actions demonstrated an unnecessary risk to a multimillion-dollar asset. Why did you deliberately disobey a direct order and choose self-recovery over mandatory ejection?" Clara looked at them, her gaze steady. "Sir, the order to eject was given after the mission was completed and the ground team was safe. Colonel Hayes declared me unlikely to succeed before I had even attempted to stabilize the aircraft. He prioritized saving face over attempting to save a pilot and a warthog. I chose to prioritize the recovery of the plane, which I knew was capable of flying. I would make that same choice 1,000 times to bring that plane, and myself, home." The colonels exchanged glances. They were about to deliver a formal reprimand for insubordination, concluding their pre-written report, when the door opened. It was Chief Miller. "Sirs," Miller said, his voice respectful but booming, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have a document pertinent to this board's finding regarding the unlikely possibility of Captain Jenkins's recovery." He placed an old, folded piece of paper on the table. A maintenance order request that IT was a damning piece of evidence. Miller had found a request Hayes had sent hours before the mission, formally reducing the number of ready recovery helicopters and listing the Vanguard SAR as low-priority asset protection. More importantly, tucked away in the notes, was a private memo from Hayes to his aide, instructing them to pre-write the loss report if Jenkins's flight went beyond the initial waypoint, just to simplify the paperwork. The document proved his malice. Hayes hadn't reacted to a crisis. He had planned for her failure. The board's demeanor collapsed. They had tried to protect Hayes' political legacy, and instead, they had exposed a deeper, dirtier truth. The reprimand vanished. Clara was cleared entirely, with a written commendation for her judgment. A week later, Clara walked onto the flight line. There, gleaming under the desert sun, was the Sentinel. The scars were gone, replaced by strong, new metal, and the nose art was restored. As she approached, Chief Miller and the ground crew stood at attention. On the fuselage, next to her name, they had painted a small, black heart with wings, forged in metal. "It's ready, Captain," Miller said, grinning. "We took the liberty of updating your call sign. We figured flight instructor didn't fit anymore." Clara smiled, a real, full smile that reached her eyes. She put her hand on the rugged skin of the warthog. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The engines roared to life, a strong, even sound. She taxied out, no longer the flight instructor, but the respected pilot of the plane that refused to die. Her new, unspoken call sign echoed across the base, a testament to her strength, Iron Heart.